CBS Young and The Restless spoilers. Paul returns to Genoa City as Jack prepares for a final battle with Markham. Patty Williams had finally been taken into custody, but for Jack Abbott, her arrest did not bring the relief everyone expected. From his hospital bed, Jack understood something the police had not yet fully accepted. Patty had never been the only threat. She had been dangerous and stable, and willing to cross every imaginable line, but much of the chaos surrounding the Abbott family had been guided by someone colder, more patient, and far more calculating. Dr. Lawrence Markham was still free, and as long as he remained beyond the reach of the law, Jack knew that no member of his family could truly be safe. Patty's capture might have closed one door, but Markham's escape had opened another, darker one. Jack could feel the danger even while lying beneath the sterile lights of the hospital room. Every unexplained sound in the hallway made him tense. Every unfamiliar face passing the glass door reminded him that Markham had once used his medical knowledge, professional reputation, and ability to manipulate vulnerable people to move through Genoa City without attracting suspicion. He could appear calm while planning something terrible. He could present himself as a respected doctor while hiding motives that were anything but honorable. Jack had survived the first attack, but survival had taught him one painful lesson: waiting for Markham to make the next move would be a mistake. The Abbott patriarch could no longer afford to remain passive, and he would not allow his injuries to make him helpless. If Markham believed Jack's weakened condition had removed him from the battle, then Markham was about to discover how badly he had underestimated him. Jack spent hours reviewing everything he knew. Patty had been arrested, but her statements were inconsistent, emotional, and filled with gaps that might have been caused by fear, confusion, or deliberate deception. She had blamed others, changed parts of her story, and refused to explain how deeply Markham had been involved. Jack suspected that Patty was still protecting him, whether out of loyalty, terror, or the belief that Markham might somehow rescue her. That possibility made the situation even more dangerous. Markham had lost control of Patty, but he had not necessarily lost access to her secrets. He knew what she had done, what she had seen, and what evidence could connect him to the attacks. A desperate man might run, but a calculating man like Markham would probably do something more strategic. He might destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, manipulate the investigation, or target the people closest to Jack. Kyle, Diane, Ashley, and Tracy had already endured enough. The Abbott family had been dragged through accusations, violence, fear, and public humiliation. Jack could not bear the thought of Markham returning to finish what Patty had started. He also knew the Genoa City Police Department faced limitations. Markham had no reason to remain in one place, and his medical training gave him knowledge of medications, false symptoms, hospital systems, and even the methods investigators might use to track him. He could change his appearance, use another identity, or leave Wisconsin before anyone realized he had gone. Jack needed someone who understood both Patty's psychology and the complicated history behind her obsession. He needed someone who could recognize her patterns without becoming distracted by her lies. Most importantly, he needed someone who would not dismiss the danger simply because Patty was behind bars. After considering every available option, one name continued to return to his mind: Paul Williams. The decision was not easy. Paul had his own history with Genoa City, his own painful memories, and a complicated connection to Patty that could never be reduced to a simple police case. Asking him to return meant asking him to reopen wounds that might never have fully healed. Jack understood that. He knew how much Paul had suffered because of Patty's actions, and how often he had been forced to balance his duty to protect the public against his instinct to protect his sister. Yet that history was exactly why Jack believed Paul was the right person. Paul knew Patty better than anyone. He understood how she could be manipulated by someone who offered affection, validation, or the promise of a new beginning. He also knew the difference between Patty acting alone and Patty acting under the influence of someone more controlling. Jack reached for his phone, hesitated, and then finally entered the number he had not called in far too long. The line rang several times before a familiar voice answered. Jack took a slow breath and forced strength into his voice. "Hello, Paul. It's Jack." There was a brief silence on the other end, the kind of silence created when years of history suddenly entered a conversation before either person had found the right words. Jack tried to soften the moment. "How are you? It's been a long time," Paul responded cautiously, but Jack could hear immediate concern beneath his guarded tone. News of Patty's arrest and Jack's hospitalization had clearly reached him. Paul asked about Jack's condition, and Jack gave him an honest answer. He was recovering, but the physical injuries were only part of the problem. Markham remained free, and Jack believed the danger was escalating rather than ending. Their conversation quickly became more intense. Jack explained that Patty's arrest had not exposed the entire truth. Markham had disappeared before the authorities could question him properly, and no one knew whether he was still in Genoa City or preparing to flee. Jack described the inconsistencies in Patty's actions, the way certain events seemed to organize to have been planned by her alone, and the troubling possibility that Markham had used Patty's instability as both a weapon and a shield. Whenever investigators moved closer, Patty's behavior became the center of attention, allowing Markham to remain in the background. Paul listened without interrupting for several minutes. His silence was not indifference. Jack recognized it as the silence of an experienced investigator assembling pieces in his mind. Paul finally admitted that Markham's disappearance changed everything. An innocent man would have remained to defend himself, particularly if his professional reputation was at risk. Running suggested fear, and fear suggested that Markham knew evidence existed somewhere. Jack agreed, but he warned Paul that Markham was not simply frightened. He was intelligent enough to understand that escape alone might not protect him. If he believed Jack or the Abbott family possessed something that could expose him, he might return before leaving town. "That's why I called you," Jack said. "I need someone who understands Patty, but I also need someone who won't underestimate Markham. He is still out there, Paul. My family is still in danger." Paul's response was measured. He reminded Jack that returning to Genoa City would not be simple. Patty was his sister, and every investigation involving her carried emotional consequences. However, Paul also knew that allowing Markham to remain free could put Patty in danger as well. If Markham feared she might confess, she could become a liability he needed to silence. That realization changed the tone of the entire conversation. Markham was not only a threat to the Abbotts, he might also be preparing to eliminate the one person who could expose him. Jack did not pressure Paul after that. He knew the decision had to come from Paul himself. Instead, he spoke honestly about his fear. He admitted that being attacked had shaken him in ways he did not want his family to see. Jack Abbott had spent decades presenting himself as strong, decisive, and capable of protecting the people he loved. Lying in a hospital bed had forced him to confront the limits of that strength. He could not chase Markham. He could not personally guard every entrance to the Abbott mansion. He could not remain beside Diane, Carl, Ashley, and Tracy at every moment. Yet he could still think, plan, and reach out to the one person whose experience might change the course of the investigation. Paul heard the frustration in Jack's voice and understood that the call was not simply about revenge. Jack was not asking Paul to hunt Markham down because he wanted someone punished. He was asking because he believed another attack was coming. Paul finally gave the answer Jack had been hoping for. He would return to Genoa City. He would review Patty's arrest, examine Markham's disappearance, and determine whether the doctor had left behind a trail the local authorities had missed. Paul made no promises about how quickly Markham could be found, but he gave Jack something more valuable, his word that he would not stop at the obvious explanation. He would follow the evidence wherever it led. When the call ended, Jack felt the first real sense of hope he had experienced since the nightmare began. It was not relief, because the danger remained, but it was the reassurance that he was no longer waiting helplessly for Markham's next move. Paul's return to Genoa City was quiet. There was no public announcement and no dramatic arrival at the police station. He understood that secrecy might be their greatest advantage. If Markham believed everyone was focused on Patty, he might become careless. If he discovered that Paul Williams had returned specifically to investigate him, he could disappear permanently. Paul went directly to the hospital, where Jack was resting after another difficult night. When the door opened and Paul stepped inside, Jack's expression changed immediately. The years between them seemed to disappear for a moment. Paul looked older and more cautious, but his eyes still carried the sharp attention of the investigator Jack remembered. Jack pushed himself upright despite the pain, and Paul moved toward the bed. They reached for each other's hands, holding on with the quiet understanding of two men who had survived decades of conflict, loss, and betrayal in Genoa City. The handshake became something more personal, an acknowledgement that neither of them had expected to meet again under circumstances this dangerous. Paul told Jack that he looked better than the reports had suggested. Jack managed a tired smile and replied that reports rarely captured the full damage. The physical wounds were healing, but the fear Markham had created was spreading through the entire family. Paul sat beside the bed, and their conversation turned immediately to the investigation. Jack provided every detail he could remember. He described Markham's behavior, his confidence, his ability to control the narrative, and the subtle way he had positioned Paddy as the obvious villain while keeping himself at a safe distance. Paul asked precise questions. Had Markham ever mentioned leaving town? Did he have access to private medical facilities? Had he used aliases? Did Paddy refer to locations, meetings, or instructions that might lead to him? Jack admitted there were still missing pieces, but he believed Paddy's fear could reveal more than her words. Whenever Markham's name was mentioned, her reactions changed. She became defensive, angry, and visibly terrified. Paul recognized the pattern. Paddy might claim she loved or trusted Markham, but fear often existed beneath relationships built on manipulation. Markham had probably convinced her that he was the only person who understood her, then used that dependence to control her actions. If Paddy now believed he had abandoned her, her loyalty could collapse. However, Paul warned Jack that confronting her too aggressively might have the opposite effect. Paddy could retreat further into denial or invent another version of events to protect herself emotionally. They needed to make her believe that telling the truth was the only way to survive. Jack asked whether Paul could reach her. Paul did not answer immediately. He knew that speaking to his sister would be the hardest part of the case, but he also knew her testimony might be the fastest path to Markham. Paul then revealed that Markham's escape appeared more carefully prepared than anyone initially realized. Early information suggested that the doctor had removed personal files, abandoned his usual phone, and possibly accessed money through an account that had not been connected to his known identity. These were not the actions of a man who panicked and ran without a plan. Markham had anticipated the possibility that Paddy would be arrested. He might even have planned to sacrifice her from the beginning. Jack's anger grew as Paul explained the implications. Paddy had committed terrible acts, but Markham might have encouraged her instability, directed her toward the Abbotts, and then disappeared when she was no longer useful. Jack wondered aloud whether Markham had another target or whether everything had always been about him. Paul believed the answer could be both. Markham's original objective might have involved Jack, but once the plan began collapsing, survival would have become his priority. Anyone capable of identifying him, connecting him to Paddy, or exposing his methods could now be at risk. Paul told Jack to increase security around the hospital and Abbott properties, but Jack responded that Markham understood conventional security. A guard at the door might not stop someone who could arrive wearing a medical coat, carrying forged identification, or using a medication to create a distraction. Paul agreed. Catching Markham would require more than waiting for him to attack. They needed to force him into the open. The two men began constructing a strategy. Jack would allow the public to believe he remained weak, confused, and unable to provide useful testimony. No one outside a very small circle would know that his memory was clearer than reports suggested. If Markham believed Jack could not identify him or explain his connection to Paddy, he might delay leaving the area. Paul, meanwhile, would work quietly, avoiding official attention until he understood the full scope of Markham's network. He would revisit Paddy's statements, investigate the doctor's finances, and trace every place where Markham might obtain medical supplies, transportation, or a new identity. Jack questioned whether using himself as bait was too dangerous, but Paul reminded him that Markham might already consider him a target. The difference was that this time they would be prepared. Still, Paul insisted that Jack follow instructions. There could be no impulsive decisions, no secret meetings, and no attempt to confront Markham alone. Jack reluctantly agreed, although Paul knew him well enough to recognize that agreement and obedience were not always the same thing when Jack Abbott's family was threatened. Before leaving the room, Paul placed a hand over Jack's again and promised that he would find the truth. Jack looked directly at him and asked the question neither man could avoid. Can you stop him before he hurts someone else? Paul's answer was firm but honest. I'm going to do everything I can, but Markham has had time to prepare, and that makes him more dangerous than ever. After Paul left, Jack stared through the hospital window at the darkening Genoa City skyline. His plan was finally moving forward, but he could not silence the feeling that Markham was already one step ahead. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, the doctor might be watching, listening, or preparing his next move. Jack wondered whether Markham had contacts inside the hospital, whether someone had unknowingly given him information, or whether his disappearance was only an illusion designed to make everyone search in the wrong direction. The possibility that Markham had never truly left Genoa City sent a chill through him. Paul's return gave the Abbots a powerful ally, but it also raised the stakes. Markham knew Paul's history with Paddy. If he discovered Paul was back, he might see him as the greatest threat to his freedom. Paul could reach Paddy emotionally, expose the manipulation, and uncover evidence that less experienced investigators had overlooked. That made Paul valuable to Jack and potentially marked for death by Markham. Meanwhile, Paul began retracing the case from the beginning. He refused to accept any detail as insignificant. Markham's professional records, his conversations with Paddy, the medications connected to the attacks, and the timing of his disappearance all had to fit together. The deeper Paul looked, the more convinced he became that Markham had constructed several escape routes. One trail appeared to lead away from Wisconsin, but another suggested recent activity much closer to Genoa City. It was possible that Markham had created false evidence to make the police believe he had crossed state lines while he remained nearby. Paul understood the logic. A fugitive hiding far away would be difficult to find, but a fugitive hiding near the investigation could observe every development and react immediately. Markham might be waiting for Paddy to break. He might be waiting for Jack to recover, or he might be waiting for the perfect moment to enter the hospital and erase the final pieces of evidence against him. Paul realized that Jack's instinct had been correct. The situation was more complicated than anyone understood, and Paddy's arrest had only begun the real investigation. When Paul prepared to question Paddy, he knew the encounter would test every part of him. He was not simply facing a suspect. He was facing his sister, a woman whose illness, choices, and obsessions had devastated countless lives. He needed to reach the part of Paddy that still understood Markham had betrayed her. If he failed, she might continue protecting the man who had used her. If he succeeded, she could provide the location, evidence, or secret that would finally bring Markham down. Yet Paul also suspected that Markham had anticipated this possibility. The doctor may have left Paddy with a warning, a threat, or even a final instruction to follow if Paul ever returned. As Paul approached the room where Paddy was being held, he noticed something unsettling in the case notes. Before her arrest, Paddy had repeatedly mentioned that Markham had an emergency solution if the plan failed. No one had asked her what that phrase meant. Paul stopped in the hallway, reading the words again. An emergency solution could mean an escape route, a hidden identity, or money. But it could also mean something far more frightening, a final act designed to destroy the evidence and everyone connected to it. Back in his hospital room, Jack received a brief message from Paul confirming that the investigation had begun. Jack should have felt reassured, but moments later, the telephone beside his bed rang from an unidentified number. He answered cautiously, expecting a hospital employee or perhaps Paul calling from another line. For several seconds, there was only silence. Then a calm male voice spoke. Bringing Paul Williams back was a mistake. Jack's blood ran cold. He recognized the controlled tone immediately. Markham was not gone. He was close enough to know about a meeting that had been kept secret. Before Jack could respond, the voice continued. Paddy was only the beginning. Tell Paul to leave Genoa City, or your family will learn what happens when you force a desperate man to finish what he started. The call ended. Jack stared at the phone, his heart pounding as the machines beside his bed began reacting to the sudden change in his pulse. He had wanted to draw Markham into the open, and the plan had worked faster than expected, but Markham's warning revealed a terrifying truth. Someone had already told him Paul was back. Paul Williams had returned to defeat Markham, but the battle was no longer a simple search for a fugitive. Markham was watching them, predicting their decisions, and preparing for war. The question was not only whether Paul could find him. It was whether Paul could expose the traitor helping Markham before the doctor struck the Abbott family again, and whether Jack's carefully designed plan had already placed Paul directly in Markham's path.